At the base of our Christian faith is the Bible, our Holy Scripture. All we need to do is search on Google, and we will find millions of comments about it. It is without a doubt the most read and published book in history. Let's go straight to the frequently asked questions. Yes, because it was inspired by Him. Was it written by God in His own handwriting? No, it was written by people we call hagiographers, inspired by God. In what language is the Bible written? The originals are in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Today we have translations in hundreds of languages. Should the Bible be interpreted in its entirety in a literal sense? No. Certainly there are obvious and common sense elements that of course must be taken literally, as when Jesus asks us to love one another. It is obvious. But from the start the Bible warns us that certain things should not be taken literally. For example, when speaking of creation, God makes the writer understand that it was through a process. In the beginning there was nothing. Then light was created, then the earth with the oceans, followed by plants, animals, and finally the human being. The writer of 3,500 years ago did not have the scientific knowledge of today and translates his inspiration into the story of the 7 days, as he was able to imagine. For the man who lived by the sea, God brought the waters together in one place so that dry land appeared on one side and the seas on the other. But in the Bible there is a second account of creation. For the man who lived in the desert, the earth was dry because God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and so God made a spring to spring forth. Two writers, 2 points of view, one truth. Likewise, in the account in Genesis chapter 1, God creates man and woman together. And in the other, in chapter 2, He first creates man, and from a rib He creates woman. In a sexist and patriarchal world, the second account requires reinforcing the idea that man and woman are of the same nature, the same flesh, the same blood. Again, two writers, 2 points of view, one truth. Why does God give us the Bible? We cannot expect to find scientific answers in the Bible. God had to use a special pedagogy to speak to people 5,000 years ago. It was an impossible task to explain the Big Bang to people who barely understood the nature that surrounded them. It is a serious mistake to expect to find scientific answers and historical precisions in the Bible. It is a book to give spiritual answers in the search for meaning of the why of things. The biblical texts have a spiritual purpose. Without distorting facts, they emphasize and give meaning to the historical events that they considered relevant to their purpose and suggest an interpretation of the events. It is a spiritual interpretation of the events. The Bible is not a journalistic record. It is not a simple chronology of events. It is a rereading of the past from the writer's present. In the Old Testament, the writer reinterprets the history of the Jewish people by looking back, like someone who looks at a family photo album and recalls moments, some pleasant and others bitter, but from a present that allows him to see the presence of God in each of those moments. It is not the same to talk about a problem while one is immersed in it when it seems to overwhelm us, than to remember it when it has already been overcome. This is the perspective of the sacred writer. The same is true in the New Testament. When the life of Jesus is narrated, the writer does so from the perspective of someone who has already witnessed His resurrection and recognizes Him as the Son of God. Imagine a grandfather who wants to tell his grandchildren episodes of his life with an old photo album on his lap. Some events will be full of joy and others instead of sadness. Each story and each photo will have a meaning, and the grandfather will try to convey not only the event that occurred, but also the emotions experienced. This is the nature of the Old Testament. Is the Bible difficult to understand? No. Once you know how it is organized and roughly what it is about, it is actually easy to read. However, sometimes it is a particular translation into our language that is difficult. Let us look at two English translations, for example, the Catholic New American Bible and the Protestant New King James Version. The King James Bible is a 1611 translation promoted by King James III of England. In 1982, it was updated and published as the New King James Version. Both translations are faithful to the original text, but sometimes each one has nuances in some words that could slightly change the interpretation of a text. Secondly, other times there are expressions specific to the region and the time that do not have the same meaning today. Let us consider these words of Jesus. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. In Jesus' time, walled cities had two large gates as the main entrance and another small entrance that only allowed the passage of people to prevent the entry of carts and pack animals while the gates remained closed. This small opening was called the eye of a needle, and Jesus was referring to this and not to a sewing needle. That is why it is important to use a Bible that has commentaries, which allow you to clarify these types of things. Look for a translation with simple language, easy to understand, and that has comments at the bottom of the page. I recommend the Catholic version, New American Bible. Is the Bible a single book? No, it is a collection of writings. These were not books as we know them today, but rolled up scrolls as was used in their time. There are very interesting archaeological studies that explain how the writings that gave rise to the Bible were formed. But beyond its formation process, what interests us most is what it has to say to the men and women of the 21st century. If the Bible is a collection of loose writings, when was the Bible formed as we know it today? In the year 382, Pope St. Damasus called the bishops to a council in Rome to clarify the issue, and after debating they selected the list that we currently know as the Bible. Pope St. Damasus then asked St. Jerome to translate the Bible into the current Latin of the time, so that anyone could understand it. Thus, the Vulgate Bible, or popular edition, arose, presented for the first time as a single book. The Bible was then organized in the following way. All the writings after the birth of Jesus, a total of 27 books, were called the New Testament. Many more books circulated at that time, but because they contained important errors, the bishops decided not to include them in the list. They are what we know as the apocryphal books. For the writings before the birth of Jesus, the subject required a little more analysis because there were too many books, very scattered. The bishops then decided to use the list used by the 70. This was a group of 72 Jewish scholars who met in Alexandria between the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ, who took on the task of compiling and translating all the texts in Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek. As a result, the Old Testament was left with a list of 46 books. However, from the 17th century onwards, our Protestant brothers decided to use the Hebrew canon dating from the 2nd century AD, which contains fewer books, thus reducing the list to only 39 books, ignoring 1,600 years of Christian tradition. That is why we Catholics affirm that the Protestant Bible is incomplete. And in the Bible, what is the name of God? In the Hebrew Bible, the name of God is written with 4 consonants and is pronounced Yahweh. This word is known as the Tetragrammaton. However, since it has no vowels, the term was sometimes commonly replaced by the words Adonai or Elohim, since Jews do not allow themselves to call God by his name, and today they write it that way. The word Jehovah is a transliteration from Hebrew to English of the Tetragrammaton of the name of God, and it began to be used in the 13th century. and our Protestant brothers propose that the word Jehovah should be kept. This is why in Bibles from Protestant publishers, the word Jehovah is used, and in Catholic publishers, the word Yahweh is used. How to search for a text in the Bible? First, to find a particular book, you look in the index when it comes to a printed Bible. It shows which page of the publication the book is located on. We already know that it is a collection of books, and for thousands of years fragments of the books were simply quoted. But it was sometimes extremely difficult to find a particular passage. That is why in 1226, Archbishop Stephen Langton decided to divide the books into chapters. Even so, it was still not easy to find a particular phrase, so the chapters were in turn divided into shorter phrases and also numbered. These are the verses. Between 1521 and 1592, the work of numbering each phrase into verses was completed. To quote or search for a phrase in the Bible, the name of the book is indicated, then the chapter number, and finally the verse number. For example, in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verse 25, Jesus also did many other things. If they were written down one by one, I don't think there would be room in the world for so many books. This is a very brief introduction to the Bible, but the important thing is to start reading it.